The Arizona Territory, 1870, a dusty frontier town where suspicion runs as deep as the drought. Young Elizabeth Mercer sees what others refuse to, not an enemy but a starving child. With trembling hands, she offers her lunch to the Apache boy hiding behind the schoolhouse. A simple act, quickly forgotten in the turning pages of her life. 20 years later, as Elizabeth stands alone against the town's most powerful men to save her father's store, a shadow falls across the doorway. The fearsome warrior who enters silences the room, his presence commanding respect and fear. But his eyes seek only her. The half-eaten apple in his hand, identical to the one she shared decades ago, stops her heart. Could one moment of childhood kindness truly change the course of two lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Copper Creek wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road when Thomas Mercer decided it would be home. Elizabeth had been just 5 then, clutching her mother's skirt as the wagon rolled to a stop. Now, at 13, she knew every creaking floorboard of the general store her father had built with his own hands. "Lizzie, mind your back before sundown," her father called as she headed for the schoolhouse, tin lunch pail swinging at her side. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains, painting the adobe buildings gold. "Yes, Pa," she replied, though her thoughts were already drifting to Miss Abernathy's promised geography lesson about lands beyond the territory. Elizabeth's mother had been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that swept through town. The same fever that had taken Mrs. Sullivan, Miss Peterson, and little Tommy Jones. But it had been hardest on Pa. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and his once ready smile now appeared only when Elizabeth managed to coax it out. "That girl's got too much of her mother in her," she'd overheard him tell Mr. Sullivan once. "Sees the good in everything, even things that aim to bite her." The schoolhouse stood on the edge of town, a small building with a bell tower that Miss Abernathy rang with military precision each morning. Elizabeth liked school well enough, especially reading. Books were windows to places far from Copper Creek and its small mines. "Elizabeth Mercer, a lady does not run," Miss Abernathy scolded as Elizabeth raced Sarah Jenkins to the steps. "Sorry, Miss Abernathy," Elizabeth said, slowing to a walk, despite the giggles bubbling up inside her. Inside, she took her seat beside Sarah, carefully placing her lunch pail under her desk. Her father had packed it that morning, bread with a thin spread of precious strawberry preserves, a small chunk of cheese, and an apple from the barrel that had arrived on yesterday's wagon. The day passed in a blur of arithmetic and geography. During the noon break, while the other children spread blankets in the yard, Elizabeth wandered behind the schoolhouse. She preferred the shade and quiet for reading. That's when she saw him, a boy no older than herself, crouched in the shadows between the schoolhouse and the brush. His clothes were ragged, his face smudged with dirt, but it was his eyes that caught her, dark and wary, like a cornered animal's. She knew immediately what he was. Apache. Stories of Apache raids were common currency in Copper Creek. Just last month, the Sullivan Ranch had lost 3 cattle, and everyone knew who to blame. Savages, they called them in hushed, fearful tones. But this was no fearsome warrior. This was a boy with hunger written across his face, his gaze fixed on the apple in Elizabeth's hand. She should run. She should scream. She knew what the townspeople would say. Instead, she took a step forward. The boy tensed, ready to flee. "It's all right," she said softly, though she doubted he understood. She held out the apple. "Are you hungry?" The boy didn't move, his eyes darting between her face and the offered fruit. Elizabeth placed the apple on the ground between them and stepped back. Then, making a decision that felt both terrifying and right, she opened her lunch pail and set out the bread and cheese beside the apple. "Go on," she encouraged, mimicking eating. "It's good." For a long moment, neither moved. Then, quick as a snake, the boy darted forward, snatched the apple, and retreated. He took a bite, juice running down his chin. The hunger in his eyes made Elizabeth's heart ache. He took another step forward, reached for the bread. "Elizabeth Mercer, what in heaven's name are you doing?" Miss Abernathy's voice shattered the moment. The boy clutched the half-eaten apple and vanished into the brush faster than Elizabeth could blink. "Nothing, Miss Abernathy," Elizabeth said, her heart hammering. "Just eating my lunch. Behind the schoolhouse? With no blanket? Come join the others this instant." Miss Abernathy's eyes narrowed at the food on the ground. "And don't waste good food. There are children starving in this territory." "Yes, Miss Abernathy," Elizabeth replied, gathering her remaining lunch. As she followed her teacher around the building, she glanced back at the empty space where the boy had been. She wondered if he had a name, if he had a family, if he would come back tomorrow. She hoped he would. The boy ran until his lungs burned. The half-eaten apple clutched in his hand as if it were made of gold. Only when he reached the shelter of a dry creek bed did he stop, crouching behind a boulder, listening for pursuit. There was no Takoda, though the white settlers would never use his name, savored each bite of the apple, the sweetness almost painful after days of near starvation. He ate the core, the seeds, everything but the stem, which he tucked into a small pouch hanging from his neck. The pouch contained all he had left of his life before, an obsidian arrowhead his father had crafted, teaching him how the stone spoke to those who knew how to listen. His father's voice seemed to whisper from it still. "Remember who you are, my son. You are Takoda of the people." 3 moons had passed since the soldiers came. Takoda had been hunting with his cousin when they heard the gunfire. From their hiding place in the rocks, they watched as the bluecoats burned the wickiups, rounded up the women and children. His cousin had tried to return to the camp. Takoda had seen him fall, the boy's body jerking as the bullets found him. Takoda ran. He ran and hid, and ran again, moving through the landscape like a ghost, using the skills his father had taught him. But he was still a child, just 12 summers, alone in a land that grew more hostile with each passing day. Game was scarce, water scarcer. The drought had driven the people from their usual hunting grounds, bringing them dangerously close to white settlement. Now he was lost, separated from the band, hunted by soldiers and settlers alike. Takoda touched the arrowhead through the leather of the pouch. It was cool against his fingers, grounding him. His father had been a respected medicine man, known for his wisdom and fairness. What would he advise now? Survive, learn, grow strong. For days, Takoda had circled the white settlement, watching from a distance. He studied their patterns, their habits, the woman who hung clothes on a line every morning, the man who brought supplies in a wagon, the children who gathered in the wooden building. He needed food, water he could find, but game had vanished from the hills. Desperation had driven him closer to the settlement than was wise. Then he saw her, the girl with hair the color of autumn grass. She walked alone, away from the others, an easy target, his hungry mind had thought at first. But something in her eyes when she spotted him, not fear, not hatred, had made him pause, and then she had offered food, freely, without threat or expectation. Takoda finished the apple and touched his still hungry stomach. The bread and cheese he hadn't managed to grab would have helped, but the apple was more than he'd had in days. Night was falling. He needed shelter. Moving with the caution his father had instilled in him, Takoda made his way further into the hills. He found a small cave, barely more than an indentation in the rock face, but it would hide him from passing eyes. As he settled against the cool stone, Takoda thought of the girl again. Her eyes reminded him of his sister's, clear and direct. His sister, who was gone now, taken by the soldiers, perhaps dead. Would the girl have offered food if she knew what he was? She must have known. His skin, his clothes, his hair, all marked him as one of the people, yet she had shared what she had. His father once told him that all people, red and white, possessed both darkness and light within them. Judge each by their actions, not by the color of their skin or the language of their tongue, he had said. The white men who killed his family had shown only darkness. But this girl, Dakota clutched the obsidian arrowhead as sleep pulled at him. Tomorrow he would try to find his people. The Apache were scattered across the territory, but there were signs for those who knew how to read them. Smoke signals in the distance, markings on trees, messages left in stone formations. But first he would return to the wooden building, just once more, to see if the autumn-haired girl would come again, and perhaps to understand why, when everyone else in this territory wanted him dead, she had offered him life instead. The years slipped by like water through cupped hands. Elizabeth grew taller, her dresses letting out until they couldn't anymore. Her father's hair grayed at the temples, and Copper Creek swelled with new arrivals seeking fortune in the nearby mines. At 16, Elizabeth stood behind the counter of Mercer General Store, tallying inventory in a leather-bound ledger. Her childhood was packed away like the faded calico dress her father had bought her for her 14th birthday, too small now, but too precious to discard. Miss Mercer, Wilford, from the bank, doffed his hat as he entered. "My, how you've grown into a fine young lady." Elizabeth smiled politely, though something in Wilford's gaze made her want to disappear into the storeroom. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wilford. Can I help you find something?" "Just checking in on your father. Is he about?" "In the back with his ledgers. I'll fetch him for you." As she turned, Wilford added, "My son James inquired about you just this morning. He'll be at the social on Saturday." Elizabeth nodded without commitment. James Wilford was handsome enough, but his easy cruelty toward those he deemed beneath him, which seemed to be most everyone, turned her stomach. In the back room, she found her father hunched over columns of numbers, spectacles perched on his nose. "Pa, Mr. Wilford's here to see you." Thomas Mercer looked up, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Thank you, Lizzie." He patted her hand. "Mind the store a bit longer?" "Of course." She hesitated. "Pa, is everything all right with the bank?" "Just business matters. Nothing for you to worry about." But Elizabeth did worry. She'd seen the letters that came monthly from the bank, noticed how her father's shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. Back at the counter, Elizabeth helped Mrs. Sullivan select fabric for new curtains while keeping an ear tuned to the murmured conversation between her father and Wilford. "Reasonable offer considering the circumstances. Need more time. Can't extend forever, Thomas." When Wilford left, her father's face was drawn. Elizabeth waited until Mrs. Sullivan departed before asking, "What did he want?" Thomas sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 57 years. "Just business talk. Nothing to trouble yourself with." "I'm not a child anymore, Pa. I help run this store." "That you do." Pride warmed his voice. "You've become quite the businesswoman. Then tell me what's wrong." Thomas removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "The drought's been hard on everyone. Farmers can't pay their accounts. Without them paying us, we struggle to pay the bank." He shrugged. "It'll turn around when the rains come." But the rains didn't come that year, or the next. What came instead were more letters from the bank, more visits from Wilford, and more lines in her father's face. By 18, Elizabeth was effectively running the store while her father's cough worsened. Doc Henderson prescribed tonics that did little good. "You need rest, Thomas," the doctor advised, "and mountain air wouldn't hurt." "And who would run the store?" Thomas asked between coughs. "I would," Elizabeth said firmly. "I've been doing it anyway." Her father started to protest, then surrendered to another coughing fit. That night Elizabeth found him at the kitchen table, staring at an old daguerreotype of her mother. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "Stubborn as she was, too." "Is that a compliment?" Elizabeth smiled. The high. 2 weeks later, Thomas Mercer departed for a sanatorium in Colorado, leaving Elizabeth alone to manage the store, their home, and the increasingly aggressive overtures from the bank. "A young lady shouldn't be running a business," Wilford told her during his first visit after her father left. "It's not proper. James would be happy to discuss a partnership through marriage." "Thank you, but I'm managing quite well." Elizabeth replied, showing him the books that proved it. Despite the drought, she'd found ways to keep the store profitable, bartering, extending credit strategically, bringing in goods the miners needed. Wilford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your father's debt won't disappear through clever bookkeeping, Miss Mercer." After he left, Elizabeth climbed to the attic and opened the trunk containing her childhood things. Beneath books and toys lay the faded calico dress. She ran her fingers over the worn fabric, remembering the girl who once wore it, the girl who'd shared her lunch with a starving Apache boy. Sometimes she wondered what had become of him. Had he survived? Found his people? Did he remember the girl who'd offered an apple and a moment of kindness? Elizabeth folded the dress carefully and returned it to the trunk. That girl was gone now, replaced by a woman with responsibilities too heavy for her years, and challenges that would require all the strength and kindness she possessed. The arrow struck the center of the target with a satisfying thud. Takoda lowered his bow, his mentor Nakohi's approving nod, the only praise he needed. At 17, Takoda stood tall among the Apache warriors, though his path to acceptance had been arduous. "Your aim improves," Nakohi said, retrieving the arrow. "But remember, hunting men requires different skills than hunting deer." Takoda nodded, running his thumb over the notches carved into his bow, one for each skill mastered: tracking, stealth, endurance, patience. The bow itself bore scars from years of use, much like its owner. 5 years had passed since Nakohi found him, half-starved, feverish, delirious, in the foothills near the white settlement. The older warrior had been scouting alone when he discovered the boy clutching an obsidian arrowhead and mumbling about a girl with hair like autumn grass. Nakohi had no children of his own. His wife and infant son had died in the same raid that had orphaned Takoda. Perhaps that shared loss explained why he had brought the boy back to his band, instead of leaving him to die. "He is of the people," Nakohi had told the skeptical tribal council, "and he has survived alone where grown men would have perished." Not everyone welcomed the boy who had lived too close to white ways. Some viewed his survival with suspicion rather than respect. Takoda had to prove himself worthy, learning their dialect, their ways of hunting, their sacred ceremonies, all while carrying the memories of his birth family like stones in his heart. "Come," Nakohi said, interrupting Takoda's thoughts. The council gathered. The White Eyes have sent another peace talker. They returned to camp, where the elders sat in a circle around a small fire. Nearby, a white man in dusty clothes waited nervously, flanked by 2 warriors. "This is Joshua Miller," the chief said as Takoda and Nakohi joined them. "He speaks for the new Indian agent," Miller nodded respectfully. "The agency wishes to discuss terms for peaceful coexistence. The government offers food, supplies, protected lands, protected until gold is found." An elder interrupted. "Then the treaties become paper for the wind to carry away." Takoda listened as the familiar dance unfolded. Promises made, suspicions raised, compromises suggested. His attention drifted to the translator, an older Apache man who had learned the white man's tongue as a captive. After the council, Takoda approached the translator. "Teach me," he said simply. The man studied him. "Why would you soil your tongue with their words? To understand our enemy, to protect our people." The translator considered this. "It will bring you pain. Their words do not fit our thoughts." "I have known pain," Takoda said, touching the scar that ran from his shoulder to his collarbone, a reminder of his first raid against white settlers who had encroached on tribal hunting grounds. And so began another education. For the next 3 years, Takoda absorbed English words like a desert absorbs rain, hungrily, completely. He learned not just to speak, but to read the white man's marks on paper. The translator brought him discarded newspapers, torn books, anything with words. "You have a gift," the translator told him one day. "Your mind bridges worlds." By 20, Takoda could move between languages as easily as he moved through forest and desert. This new skill earned him a place in trade negotiations and peace talks. He began to understand the white settlers' fears and desires. So different yet so similar to his people's. They are not all evil, he told Nokihi, after returning from his first solo diplomatic mission to a trading post. Some seek peace as we do. Nokihi's face remained impassive. A few good hearts do not change the hunger of their kind for our land. No, Takoda agreed, but understanding them might help us survive them. That night, as the camp slept, Takoda held the obsidian arrowhead to the firelight. The stone gleamed, revealing depths within its darkness, like memory, like truth. He still thought of her sometimes, the girl who had offered food instead of fear. In his dreams she appeared older, her face clearer than seemed possible after so brief an encounter. Her kindness had planted a seed that grew alongside his strength and skill, a belief that perhaps not all bridges between his people and the whites were destined to burn. One day, he whispered to the stars, I will find you again, and I will repay your kindness. The scarred bow lay beside him, its notches testifying to the warrior he had become. But the arrowhead in his palm spoke of the boy he had been, and of a debt still unpaid. The tarnished bell above the door jangled, announcing yet another unwelcome visitor. Elizabeth looked up from her ledger, forcing a polite smile despite recognizing Clayton Hargrove's imposing silhouette. Miss Mercer. Clayton removed his hat, revealing slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. At 45, he owned half the businesses in Copper Creek, with ambitions for the rest. Lovely as always, Mr. Hargrove, what can I help you with today? 10 years of running the store alone had taught Elizabeth to keep her tone professional, regardless of her feelings. Clayton strolled through the store, fingering merchandise. Just checking how you're holding up. Times are tough for a woman alone in business. Elizabeth bristled. At 33, she'd outlasted predictions of her failure many times over. We're managing quite well, thank you. Indeed, impressive given your father's outstanding obligations. Thomas Mercer had passed 3 winters ago, the mountain air having prolonged his life but not saved it. His funeral had barely ended when Wilford presented Elizabeth with the full accounting of her inheritance, a thriving store and crippling debt. I've maintained regular payments to the bank, Elizabeth said. Clayton chuckled. Charles Wilford and I were just discussing your situation. He's concerned about the long-term viability of your arrangement. Is he? Elizabeth continued tallying inventory, refusing to show anxiety. Strange he hasn't mentioned it to me directly. Railroad's coming, Miss Mercer. Clayton's voice dropped. Progress waits for no one. This building sits on what will soon be the most valuable land in town. Elizabeth finally looked up. Is that why you're here? To discuss real estate? I'm here to offer a solution. Clayton leaned on the counter. Sell to me now, at a fair price, enough to clear your debts and start fresh somewhere else. This store has been in my family for 28 years, Mr. Hargrove. Sentimentality is a luxury, Miss Mercer, one you can ill afford. His eyes narrowed, especially given recent incidents. The broken windows, missing deliveries, mysterious cancellations from long-time suppliers. Elizabeth had suspected Clayton's involvement, but could prove nothing. I'll consider your offer, she said, though they both knew she wouldn't. After Clayton left, Elizabeth locked the door and flipped the closed sign early. Upstairs in her small apartment, she retrieved her father's correspondence box from beneath the floorboards. Letters from the territorial governor, railroad surveys, and most importantly, the original land grant, with clear boundaries, that included water rights to Simpson Creek. The land beneath the store was indeed valuable, more than Clayton realized. Her father had purchased it, knowing the natural spring made it essential for any future development. He'd confided this to Elizabeth before departing for Colorado, making her promise to hold on to the property no matter what. They'll try to take it, he'd warned. Men like Wilford and Hargrove see only profit, not people. A knock interrupted her thought. Through the window she spotted Sarah Jenkins, now Sarah Miller, clutching a basket. "Brought you some bread," Sarah said, when Elizabeth opened the door. "James told me Clayton paid you a visit." James Miller, once the assistant to the former sheriff, now ran the telegraph office. His position made him privy to conversations not meant for public ears. Offering to buy the store again, Elizabeth set out teacups, more insistent this time. Sarah lowered her voice despite being alone. James heard Clayton and Wilford talking. The railroad contract is nearly finalized. They're securing properties along the proposed line. By fair means or foul, the Peterson place burned last night. They're calling it an accident. Elizabeth's hands stilled. The Petersons refused to sell last month. They've accepted Clayton's offer now. Sarah squeezed Elizabeth's hand. "Be careful." After Sarah left, Elizabeth stood in the empty store, the silence broken only by the clock's steady ticking. Her gaze fell on the tarnished bell above the door. It had announced her father's first customer, 28 years ago. It had announced her mother's friends bringing food after the funeral. It had announced generations of townspeople seeking goods and gossip in equal measure. Now it announced only trouble. Elizabeth ran her finger along the counter's worn edge. This store had been her playground, then her schoolroom, now her battlefield. She thought of her father's courage, her mother's determination. Their legacy lived in these walls. "I won't sell," she whispered to the empty room. "No matter what." Outside, thunder rumbled as the first storm in months gathered. Elizabeth glanced at the ceiling, hoping the roof patches would hold. Like her resolve, like her courage, like her future, uncertain but standing firm against the gathering storm. Copper Creek had grown in 20 years, but its essence remained unchanged. Takoda observed the town from horseback, noting new buildings among familiar landmarks. The schoolhouse had a fresh coat of paint. The church steeple stood taller, but the prejudice that seemed eternal, evident in the stairs that followed him down the main street. His U.S. Indian Agency badge gleamed in the sunlight, a silver shield that opened doors but didn't change hearts. The irony wasn't lost on him. The starving Apache boy had returned as a government representative, tasked with negotiating between his people and those who had once hunted them. Apache, a child pointed before being hushed by his mother Coda, remained impassive, his black hair now cut shorter than tradition allowed, his clothing a compromise between worlds, buckskin pants, white man's shirt, and a vest adorned with tribal patterns. His leather saddlebags carried documents from Washington alongside sacred items from his people, physical embodiments of his divided existence. At the saloon, men fell silent as he entered. Takoda approached the bar with measured steps. "Water," he said, placing a coin on the counter. The bartender hesitated before serving him. "We don't want trouble." "Nor do I," Takoda replied, his English deliberate and clear. A heavy-set man at a corner table snorted. "Since when do Apaches speak the king's English?" "Since they realized it was the only language white men listened to," Takoda answered without turning. The saloon patrons chuckled nervously. Takoda gathered information from their murmured conversations, railroad negotiations, property disputes, the stubborn woman refusing to sell her store. When he finished his water, Takoda asked, "Where might I find Mercer General Store?" "End of the street," the bartender answered. "Though she'll be closing soon." Takoda nodded his thanks and departed, aware of eyes following him through the windows. His heart quickened as he approached the store. 20 years of wondering, searching, preparing for this moment. Would she remember? Would she care? The questions had haunted him across campfires and council meetings, through battles and peace talks. He touched his saddlebag, feeling the shape of the apple nestled inside, perfectly carved from cedar, painted and polished until it gleamed like the real fruit. A gift he had created years ago, waiting for this day. Outside the store, voices raised in argument drew his attention. Through the window, he saw her. Older, of course, but unmistakable. Elizabeth Mercer stood behind the counter, facing two men whose postures spoke of intimidation. "The offer expires today, Miss Mercer," the older man said. "Be reasonable. I've given you my answer, Miss Wilford." Elizabeth replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. The store is not for sale. Clayton's patience has limits. The younger man, Wilford's son, judging by the resemblance, leaned forward. Accidents happen to stubborn people. Dakota had heard enough. He entered without knocking, the bell above the door announcing his presence. All three turned, conversation halting mid-sentence. The shock on their faces might have amused him under different circumstances. The Wilfords recovered first, straightening their postures, hands drifting toward waistbands where weapons might be concealed. "Store's closing," the younger Wilford said. "Take your business elsewhere, Indian." Dakota ignored him, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth. 20 years fell away in an instant. Her hair had darkened somewhat. Lines had formed at the corners of her eyes, but they were the same eyes, direct, honest, unafraid. "This is federal business," Dakota said, touching his badge without looking away from Elizabeth. "I suggest you gentlemen continue your discussion another time." "Federal business," the elder Wilford scoffed. "Since when does the government send savages to conduct business?" "Since the government realized that some tasks require both wisdom and strength," Dakota replied evenly, qualities often lacking in other representatives. The insult, delivered with perfect composure, reddened Wilford's face. "Come, James, we'll return when Miss Mercer has rid herself of unwanted company." After they departed, silence filled the store. Elizabeth stood motionless, studying him with a puzzled expression. "Do I know you?" she finally asked. Dakota reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the wooden apple, perfectly halved as the real one had been 2 decades earlier. He placed it on the counter between them. "Once," he said softly, "a hungry boy accepted food from a kind girl who saw him as human, when others saw only an enemy." Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in recognition. "The Apache boy," she whispered. "Behind the schoolhouse." Dakota nodded, a slight smile softening his stern features. "I promised myself I would return one day, to thank you properly for a kindness never forgotten. Please, sit." Elizabeth gestured to the chair across from her small kitchen table. The store had been closed, the shades drawn against curious eyes. The teacup she handed Dakota had a hairline crack running along its rim, imperfect but still serviceable, like many things in her life. Dakota accepted it with a nod, his large hands making the cup look fragile. "You're not afraid to be alone with me," he observed. "Should I be?" Elizabeth asked, studying him openly. "Most white women would be." A hint of amusement touched his eyes. "Most white men, too. I've never been most people." Elizabeth sipped her tea. "But then, neither have you, I suspect." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with 20 years of unshared history. "You remembered me," Elizabeth finally said. "All this time, the girl who offered food to an enemy." Dakota set down his cup. "Such moments are not forgotten. You weren't my enemy, just a hungry child. Your neighbors would have disagreed. My neighbors disagreed with most of my choices." Elizabeth smiled wryly. "They still do, so I gathered from your visitors." Dakota's expression hardened. "They threatened you." Elizabeth sighed. "Clayton Hargrove wants my land for the railroad. Wilford wants the debt repaid. Neither expects a woman to stand in their way. Yet you do. This store was my parents' dream. It's all I have left of them." She traced the crack in her own teacup. "I can't simply abandon it, even if staying puts you in danger." Spoken by a man who returned to a town where half the population would happily see him dead, Elizabeth countered. Dakota inclined his head, acknowledging the point. "We both take risks for what matters." "Why did you come back, really?" Elizabeth asked. "It can't simply be to thank me for an apple from 20 years ago. Truth has many layers." Dakota's gaze was steady. "I am here officially as a representative of the Indian Agency. The railroad will cross both territorial and tribal lands. I am to ensure treaties are respected. And unofficially." "Unofficially," His voice softened. I wished to see if the girl with autumn hair had grown into the woman I imagined she might. Color warmed Elizabeth's cheeks. And has she? She has exceeded expectation. The simple statement, delivered without flattery, affected Elizabeth more than any flowery compliment from would-be suitors. She busied herself refilling their cups. Tell me, she said, what happened to you after that day? Takoda recounted his journey. Adoption by Nakoha, years of training, learning English, becoming a liaison between worlds. Elizabeth listened, occasionally asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. In turn, she shared her own path, taking over the store, losing her father, fighting to maintain independence in a town that viewed an unmarried businesswoman with suspicion. Your situation, Hargrove and Wilford, is dangerous, Takoda said when she finished. More than you may realize. I'm aware of the risk, Elizabeth's voice hardened. They've already intimidated others into selling. The Peterson place burned mysteriously after they refused Hargrove's offer. And you still refuse? The store sits above a natural spring. My father knew its value. The water rights alone make this property worth fighting for. Takoda's expression changed subtly. Water rights are precisely what concerns my people in the treaty negotiations. Then we have common interests against common enemies. Elizabeth met his gaze direct. Perhaps that's why you've returned now, of all times. Perhaps, Takoda studied her, or perhaps some debts transcend time and circumstance. You owe me nothing, Elizabeth said softly. I disagree. Takoda reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. Which is why I purchased the land adjacent to yours yesterday. Elizabeth stared at the deed he placed between them. You, what? The former Grady property, 1 acre bordering your eastern boundary. But why? An ally with property rights can speak in ways others cannot. Takoda's smile held a predatory edge. Hargrove and Wilford must now contend with both of us. Elizabeth laughed suddenly, the sound startling them both. Oh, to see their faces when they discover their new neighbor. I anticipate the conversation with interest. Takoda's eyes crinkled at the corners, though I suspect they'll be less amused than you. Their gazes held across the table, conspirators now as well as old acquaintances. The cracked teacups between them, everyday vessels elevated by circumstance to symbols of an unexpected alliance. Welcome to Copper Creek, Mr. Elizabeth realized she didn't know his full name. Takoda. He inclined his head. In your language it would translate to friend to all, though in Copper Creek perhaps friend to one is more accurate. For now, Elizabeth replied, raising her cup in a small toast. For now, Sunday morning in Copper Creek meant church bells and starched collars. Elizabeth sat in the Mercer family pew, third from the front, where she had sat every Sunday since childhood. The hymnal in her hands was worn at the edges, her family name inscribed in her father's careful script on the inside cover. Whispers rustled like dry leaves behind her. News of Takoda's return and his purchase of the Grady property had spread through town faster than wildfire. Elizabeth kept her eyes forward, her back straight, though she felt the weight of stairs between her shoulder blades. Abomination, someone murmured. Consorting with savages. Pastor Whitfield's sermon seemed particularly pointed that morning. We must guard against those who would corrupt our community, he intoned, his gaze sweeping over the congregation before settling briefly on Elizabeth. Those who invite the serpent into our garden. Elizabeth closed the hymnal softly. 20 years ago, the same pastor had preached against her father, extending credit to Mexican farmers during the drought. Before that, against her mother, teaching the Chinese laundry workers' children to read. The Mercers had always stood apart in their stubborn kindness. After the final hymn, Elizabeth moved toward the exit, only to find her path blocked by Wilford, his son James, and Clayton Hargrove. Miss Mercer. Clayton's voice carried just far enough for nearby parishioners to hear. I understand you've been entertaining an Apache in your home, alone. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. Mr. Takoda is a federal agent conducting official business. Is that what they call it now? James smirked. Mind your insinuations, Mr. Wilford, Elizabeth replied, her voice sharp as a blade. They reflect poorly on your character, not mine. Your father would be ashamed, the elder Wilford said. Thomas was a businessman who understood progress. My father understood the difference between progress and predation. Elizabeth clutched the hymnal tighter. As do I. The Apache purchased Grady's land with your knowledge, Clayton said. Don't deny it. Mr. Takoda makes his own decisions. As do I. This town won't stand for it. Clayton stepped closer. An Apache owning property on Main Street. A woman defying town leaders. Lines are being crossed, Miss Mercer. Elizabeth held her ground. Perhaps those lines needed crossing, Mr. Hargrove. Elizabeth, Sarah Miller, appeared at her side, her husband James hovering protectively nearby. We're having Sunday dinner. Won't you join us? The invitation, offered loudly enough for all to hear, was a declaration of allegiance. Clayton's jaw tightened as he stepped aside, allowing Elizabeth to pass. Outside, beneath the white steeple, Sarah squeezed Elizabeth's arm. Everyone's talking about your Apache. He's not my Apache, Elizabeth corrected. He's a federal agent who happens to be Apache, who happens to have purchased land next to yours, James Miller added, his expression troubled. Be careful, Elizabeth. Clayton was at the telegraph office yesterday, sending messages to the territorial capital about Apache insurrection. That's absurd. Absurd but dangerous, Sarah said. They're trying to undermine his official standing. Elizabeth sighed. Thank you for your support in there. The Millers have always stood with the Mercers, James said simply, though we may be in the minority this time. As Elizabeth walked home, she noticed mothers pulling children closer, men watching from storefronts, curtains twitching in windows. Copper Creek was choosing sides. At the store, she found the first physical evidence of that choice. A brick through her front window, shards of glass scattered across merchandise. Pinned to the brick was a note, "No Indians in Copper Creek." Elizabeth was sweeping up glass when the door opened. She looked up, expecting Takoda, but instead found Pastor Whitfield. I don't condone vandalism, he said without preamble, but you condone the sentiment behind it. Elizabeth set aside the broom. The pastor sighed. Your parents were good people, Elizabeth, generous to a fault, but they never understood the natural order of things. And what order is that? God separated the races for a reason. He gestured to the broken window. This is what comes of defying his will. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the hymnal she'd brought home from church. Funny, I don't recall Jesus refusing to break bread with Samaritans. This isn't about scripture, isn't it? Elizabeth opened the hymnal to the inscription page. My father wrote here, may these songs remind us that all are welcome at the Lord's table. Perhaps you should preach from that text next Sunday. Pastor Whitfield's face hardened. I came to warn you as a courtesy to your father's memory. Distance yourself from the Apache, or face the consequences. Thank you for your concern, Elizabeth replied coolly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have glass to sweep. After the pastor left, Elizabeth sank onto a stool, the hymnal clutched to her chest. The weight of the town's judgment pressed upon her, heavier than she'd anticipated. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was the store worth this? Was standing with Takoda worth becoming an outcast? The store bell jangled. Elizabeth looked up to find Takoda in the doorway, his expression darkening at the sight of broken glass. You're bleeding, he said, moving toward her. Elizabeth glanced at her hand, surprised to see a thin line of blood where glass had cut her palm. Like the town's prejudice, she'd been too focused on the larger damage to notice the smaller wound. It's nothing, she said. Takoda took her hand anyway, his touch gentle as he examined the cut. Nothing is rarely nothing, Elizabeth Mercer. Lamplight cast long shadows across the map, spread between them on Elizabeth's kitchen table. Takoda's precise hand had drawn every detail of their adjoining properties, the natural spring, and the surrounding terrain. If we combine our lands, he explained, tracing a finger along the boundary line, we create a space, large enough for a proper trading post. He indicated the area where the spring bubbled up from underground, with water access that neither Hargrove nor the railroad can legally divert. Elizabeth studied the drawing. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A partnership." Dakota's eyes held hers. "Your store becomes part of a larger enterprise, one that serves both the town and my people." "A trading post run by an Apache and a woman?" Elizabeth couldn't help but laugh. "Copper Creek will have collective apoplexy." "Copper Creek will adapt," Dakota replied with a certainty that Elizabeth found both reassuring and naive. "Or it will be left behind. The territorial governor supports initiatives that promote peaceful commerce between settlers and tribes. The territorial governor doesn't live in Copper Creek." "No," Dakota acknowledged, "but his authority supersedes local sentiment. And I have his ear." Elizabeth traced the outline of her store on the map. "My father always said location was everything in business. He chose this spot because of the spring, knowing that whoever controlled the water would ultimately control the town's growth." "Your father was wise." Dakota indicated the creek that gave the town its name. "The drought years proved him right. When the creek ran low, your spring remained. And now the railroad needs water for its steam engines." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "No wonder Clayton is so determined. It's not just water. Your combined properties create the only viable path for the railroad to reach the proposed station site." Dakota added a dotted line to the map. "Without access through our land, they must go miles out of their way, around the mesa." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "You knew this when you bought the Grady property?" Dakota's smile was subtle. "I did my research. So we have leverage, considerable leverage." Dakota confirmed, "Enough to negotiate terms that protect both our interests." Elizabeth stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkened street. The store's broken window had been boarded up, a visible reminder of the town's hostility. "They'll fight us." "Yes, they might hurt you." Dakota joined her at the window, his reflection appearing beside hers in the glass. "I've faced worse enemies than angry merchants." "I haven't," Elizabeth admitted. "Then I'll teach you what I know." His voice softened. "As you once taught me that kindness can come from unexpected places." Elizabeth turned to face him. "Why risk so much for a trading post?" "For me? For 20 years I've lived between worlds, belonging fully to neither." Dakota gestured to the map. "This represents more than business. It's a bridge between those worlds. And I'm part of that bridge." Elizabeth asked. "You were its foundation," Dakota said simply. "The first white person to see me as human." The honesty in his voice touched something deep within Elizabeth. She'd spent years maintaining a careful distance from others, protecting herself from disappointment. Yet here stood a man who had carried the memory of a single act of kindness across decades. "I'll need to review my father's papers," she said, returning to the practical. "Ensure there are no legal impediments." "Of course," Dakota rolled up the map. "I'll speak with my colleagues at the agency. They'll arrive within the week to support our proposal." Colleagues, 2 agents, 1 Apache, 1 white, and Nako, my mentor. A hint of amusement touched Dakota's eyes. "Copper Creek is about to become much more diverse." "Clayton will be beside himself," Elizabeth said, unable to suppress a smile. "A side benefit." Dakota handed her the map. "Keep this safe. It shows more than just our properties." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, a moment of contact that lingered. Elizabeth found herself studying his hands, strong, capable, marked with the scars of a difficult life. Not so different from her own, which bore the calluses of years of hard work. "It's late," she said, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the hour. "People will talk. People already talk." Dakota moved toward the door. "But I respect your reputation. My reputation was compromised the moment you walked into my store." Elizabeth replied without regret. "Some things are worth the cost." Dakota paused, his hand on the doorknob. "The girl who shared her lunch has grown into a woman of remarkable courage. The starving boy has become a man of vision." Elizabeth countered. Their gazes held, acknowledging something neither was ready to name. Then Takoda nodded once and departed, leaving Elizabeth alone with the map. A paper bridge between past and future, between separate worlds that might, against all odds, find common ground. The sheriff's office smelled of tobacco and neglect. Sheriff Prescott, a recent Clayton appointment after the previous sheriff's convenient retirement, watched with thinly veiled hostility as Elizabeth and James Miller examined the territorial record book. Found anything interesting in those dusty pages? Prescott drawled, boots propped on his desk. Just confirming some boundary lines, James replied neutrally. As telegraph operator, he maintained careful political neutrality, though his sympathies lay with Elizabeth. Elizabeth turned another brittle page, finger tracing the carefully recorded land transfers of Copper Creek's founding. She'd convinced James to accompany her to access these public records. A woman alone would have been denied. 15 more minutes, Prescott said. Got actual police work waiting. Elizabeth nodded absently, focused on entries from 25 years ago. Her father had mentioned something about the original land grants, some irregularity he'd discovered, but never fully explained. Here, she whispered to James, indicating a notation beside the Mercer property description, including perpetual rights to underground water sources as per Territorial Water Act of 1840. Because it's a different type of right, Elizabeth murmured. Not just land ownership, but water rights in perpetuity. They continued through the records until James nudged her, pointing to another entry. This one recorded Clayton Hargrove's purchase of the Sullivan Ranch 5 years ago. The marginalia caught Elizabeth's attention, subject to existing water rights of adjacent properties. He knew, Elizabeth breathed. Clayton knew about my water rights when he bought the Sullivan place. And the Peterson farm, James added, finding that record. Same notation. Elizabeth flipped forward to recent transactions, including Takoda's purchase of the Grady property. Look, Takoda's deed includes the same water rights language as mine. That can't be coincidence, James. Sheriff, a voice called from the doorway. Clayton Hargrove stood there, his expression darkening at the sight of Elizabeth. Didn't expect to find you here, Miss Mercer. Public records are open to all citizens, Mr. Hargrove. Elizabeth replied calmly, though her heart raced. Indeed. Clayton approached the table. Finding anything of interest? Just familiarizing myself with the town's history. Elizabeth closed the book casually. Thank you, Sheriff, we're finished. Outside, James spoke quietly. You realize what this means? Clayton's been trying to assemble all properties with water rights, and my father ensured ours couldn't be separated from the land, Elizabeth finished. Which explains why Clayton couldn't simply divert the water. He needs the actual property. The railroad needs water for the steam engines, James said. Without your spring, the station can't function properly. And without Takoda's adjoining land, they can't create a large enough reservoir. Elizabeth felt a surge of understanding. Our partnership threatens their entire plan. At the store, Elizabeth found Takoda deep in conversation with an older Apache man and 2 agency officials, one white, one Apache as promised. They stood when she entered. Elizabeth Mercer, Takoda introduced. This is Agent Daniel Blackwood, Agent William Running Bear, and my mentor, Nekahu. Elizabeth greeted each man, noting Nekahu's appraising gaze. The older Apache's face remained impassive, but his eyes missed nothing. Miss Mercer, Agent Blackwood said, Takoda speaks highly of your business acumen and your courage, Agent Running Bear added with a slight smile. I've discovered something about our properties. Elizabeth explained her findings from the territorial records. The water rights are explicitly protected by territorial law, which strengthens our position considerably, Blackwood nodded. It also explains why Clayton has been pressuring all landowners with water access. Elizabeth continued. He's been systematically acquiring every property with water rights. Except yours, Takoda observed. And now yours. Elizabeth turned to him. Did you know about the water rights when you purchased the Grady property? I suspected, Takoda admitted. The agency has been monitoring Hargrove's land acquisitions for months. His activities have disrupted tribal access to traditional water sources. So this isn't just about our trading post, Elizabeth realized. It's about stopping Clayton's water monopoly. The trading post is genuine, Dakota assured her. But yes, there are larger concerns. Nako spoke for the first time, his English accented but clear. Water is life. Those who control it control everything. Clayton has apparently offered the tribal council access to water in exchange for mineral rights on reservation land. Agent Running Bear explained. A deeply unfavorable exchange. Blackwood added. Our trading post would provide an alternative, Dakota said. Fair trade instead of exploitation. Elizabeth's mind raced with implications. Clayton isn't just fighting for profit, he's fighting for power. Power that would extend well beyond Copper Creek, Dakota confirmed. The territorial record book had revealed more than property lines. It had exposed a calculated plan to control the region's most precious resource. And Elizabeth's small store with its natural spring stood at the center of the conflict. They'll come at us harder now, she said quietly. Nako's weathered face creased in a slight smile. Then it is good you are not standing alone, daughter of Mercer. Elizabeth met Dakota's eyes across the room, feeling the weight of what they'd begun, and the strength of their unlikely alliance. Dusk settled over Copper Creek, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple. Elizabeth sat on her back porch, the silver hair comb in her hands catching the last light. Her mother's initials were engraved on its spine. AMM Anne-Marie Mercer. A woman Elizabeth barely remembered, but whose strength she had inherited. The sound of footsteps made her look up. Dakota approached from the path connecting their properties, his expression grave. They've cut off your supply wagons, he said without preamble. I just spoke with the Miller boy who works at the stage office. Hargrove told the freight company your account was delinquent. Elizabeth sighed. A lie, of course. Of course. Dakota settled on the step beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Your supplies will now come through the agency wagons. Hargrove can't interfere with federal shipments. Thank you. Elizabeth tucked the comb into her pocket. Though that will only infuriate him further. Let him rage. Dakota's voice was calm. Each obstacle makes our position stronger. They sat in companionable silence as darkness gathered. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain. After a week of frantic activity, meetings with the agents, drafting plans for the trading post, cataloging inventory, this moment of quiet felt like a gift. Your mother's? Dakota asked, nodding toward the pocket where she'd tucked the comb. Yes. One of the few things I have of hers. Elizabeth drew it out again. She died when I was 10. Fever. I'm sorry. She was beautiful and kind. Elizabeth traced the engraved initials. She taught the Chinese laundry workers' children to read. Scandalized the town, a family tradition it seems. Dakota's voice held gentle amusement. Mercers have never been popular in Copper Creek. Elizabeth agreed with a small smile. My father used to say, do what's right, not what's easy. He lived by that, even when it cost him. A good teaching. What about your parents? Elizabeth asked. You've never spoken of them. Dakota was silent for a long moment. My father was a Metin man. He taught me to listen to the land, to find harmony in all things. His voice softened. My mother wove the most beautiful baskets in the tribe. Her hands were always moving. What happened to them? Soldiers came. The words were simple, devastating. I was 12, hunting with my cousin when we heard the gunfire. Elizabeth's hand moved instinctively to cover his. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago. Dakota turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers, but it shaped everything that came after, including this moment, Elizabeth said softly. Yes, his gaze held hers in the gathering darkness, though not in ways I could have imagined. The air between them seemed to thicken. Elizabeth was acutely aware of his hand holding hers, the warmth of his shoulder near hers, the depth in his eyes that reflected more than just the last light of day. What happens when this is over? She asked. when the trading post is built and Clayton is defeated. Do you believe it will end so neatly? No, she admitted. But I need to believe there's an after. After, Dakota repeated, as if testing the word. After, I will continue my work with the agency, building bridges where I can. Here, that depends on what? His thumb traced circles on her palm, on whether there's reason to stay. Elizabeth's heart quickened. And what would constitute a reason? Something worth building a life around. Dakota's gaze never wavered. Someone worth crossing worlds for. The directness of his answer took her breath away. In Copper Creek, courtship followed strict conventions, chaperoned meetings, formal declarations of intent. This honest acknowledgement of feeling between them broke every social rule she'd been raised with, and yet nothing had ever felt more right. Elizabeth removed the silver comb from her pocket and held it out to him. My mother gave this to me before she died. She said to save it for someone who sees my heart, not just my face. Dakota looked at the offered heirloom, understanding its significance. Elizabeth, I'm not proposing marriage, she said quickly, color rising in her cheeks. Just acknowledging possibilities. Dakota took the comb carefully, examining its delicate workmanship. Then, with gentle hands, he reached up and slid it into her hair, securing a loose strand. In my culture, he said, to accept such a gift is to accept responsibility for the giver's well-being, to promise protection and loyalty. Is that a burden you're willing to bear? Elizabeth, it is no burden, Dakota said softly, his fingers lingering near her cheek. It is an honor I never expected. The distance between them diminished, the warmth of his breath mingling with hers. Elizabeth closed her eyes, surrendering to the inevitability of this moment, born from a childhood encounter and nurtured across 20 years of separate journeys. His lips found hers, gentle at first, then with growing certainty. The silver comb gleamed in her hair, a witness to new beginnings built on ancient foundations. When they finally drew apart, the stars had emerged above them. Elizabeth touched the comb in her hair, her mother's gift now transformed into a symbol of something unexpected and precious. They'll never accept this, she whispered. The town. Then we build something new, Dakota replied. Something better. In that moment, with his hand still holding hers, Elizabeth believed it possible. The town hall bell rang with urgent authority, its sound echoing across Copper Creek. Elizabeth watched from her store window as people hurried toward the meeting, faces set with purpose and prejudice. It's a trap, Sarah Miller warned, adjusting her bonnet. Clayton called this meeting specifically to turn the town against you and Dakota. I know, Elizabeth replied, but not attending would only confirm their accusations. Then we face them together. Sarah squeezed Elizabeth's hand. James will meet us there. Outside, the mid-morning sun beat down mercilessly. Elizabeth felt the weight of stares as she and Sarah walked toward the town hall. Whispers followed them like shadows, consorting with savages, betraying her father's legacy, unnatural relations. Elizabeth kept her chin high, though each murmur stung. The silver comb secured her hair, a private reminder of her commitment to the path she'd chosen. The town hall was packed, men standing against walls, women filling benches. At the front, Clayton Hargrove, Charles Wilford, and Sheriff Prescott presided like judges. Pastor Whitfield sat prominently beside them, lending religious authority to their proceedings. Elizabeth and Sarah found seats beside James Miller. Elizabeth scanned the room for Dakota, but didn't see him. Agent Blackwood nodded to her from the back corner, his presence both reassurance and concern. Why had the agency sent him alone? Citizens of Copper Creek, Clayton began, his voice carrying to the rafters. We face an unprecedented threat to our community's future. The railroad, which promises prosperity for all, is being obstructed by selfishness and unnatural alliances. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Miss Mercer, Clayton continued, turning toward Elizabeth, has not only refused fair compensation for her property, but has allied herself with an Apache who claims federal authority. He doesn't claim it. Elizabeth stood, her voice steady. Dakota is an officially appointed Indian agent with documents from the territorial governor. Documents can be forged, Sheriff Prescott interjected, especially by those with questionable loyalties. Are you accusing a federal agent of forgery, Sheriff? James Miller rose beside Elizabeth. That's a serious allegation. What's serious is the obstruction of progress, Wilford declared. This town needs the railroad. Miss Mercer's store and the Apache's plot stand in the way of prosperity for all. Not prosperity for all, Elizabeth countered. Profit for few. You've systematically acquired water rights throughout the region, Mr. Hargrove. The territorial records prove it. Smart business, Clayton shrugged. Unlike your sentimental attachment to a failing store. The Mercer store isn't failing, Sarah called out. You've just done everything possible to make it fail, threatening suppliers, spreading lies, even vandalism. Serious accusations require proof, Mrs. Miller. Pastor Whitfield said smoothly, something noticeably absent from these emotional outbursts. The town hall doors opened, and Elizabeth's heart leaped as Dakota entered. He wore his official agency uniform, the silver badge prominent on his chest. Behind him came Nakihei, Agent Running Bear, and 3 Apache warriors in traditional dress. A hush fell over the room, followed by alarmed whispers. What is the meaning of this? Clayton demanded. Armed Indians in our town meeting. Federal representatives, Dakota corrected calmly, responding to your invitation to discuss community concerns. I issued no such invitation to me. Dakota approached the front, his bearing dignified despite the hostility surrounding him. Yet you discuss my property, my character, and my people. Common courtesy suggests I should be present. This is a Eanes-only meeting, Sheriff Prescott declared, hand moving to his gun belt. Then you exclude half the landowners affected by your railroad plans, Dakota replied. Poor strategy for negotiation. There is no negotiation, Clayton snapped. The railroad will come through Copper Creek. Either cooperate or face the consequences. Threats, Mr. Hargrove. Agent Blackwood stepped forward. Against federal agents and law-abiding citizens. That could be construed as obstruction of justice. Clayton's face reddened. This town meeting is about preserving our way of life. By stealing land and water rights, Elizabeth challenged. By intimidating anyone who stands in your way. By preventing unnatural alliances that violate God's natural order. Pastor Whitfield thundered, rising to his feet. Elizabeth Mercer has betrayed her community by harboring an Apache and engaging in immoral relations. Gasps echoed through the hall. Elizabeth felt blood rush to her face, but before she could respond, Dakota spoke. Miss Mercer has shown courage and integrity that this town should emulate, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. She stands for fair business practices, while certain town leaders manipulate water rights for personal gain. The Apache accuses us of theft, Wilford laughed bitterly, rich irony. Not accusations, Agent Running Bear interjected. Facts. We have documentation of water rights violations affecting both settlers and tribal lands. Documentation we are presenting to the territorial governor, Agent Blackwood added, unless a more equitable solution can be reached. Such as, Clayton asked, eyes narrowed. A trading post, Elizabeth said clearly, on our combined properties, serving all communities fairly. Preposterous, Wilford exploded. Progressive, Dakota countered, and inevitable. The governor supports initiatives that foster peaceful commerce. Clayton strode forward, yanking the bell rope that hung beside the podium. The sharp clang silenced the room. This meeting is concluded, he declared, but this matter is far from over. Those who stand against progress will not prevail in Copper Creek. As people filed out, their faces reflected the division tearing through the community. Some nodded respectfully to Elizabeth, others avoided her gaze entirely. The battle lines were clearly drawn. Outside, Elizabeth joined Dakota and the agents. That went as expected, Agent Blackwood observed, dryly. It was never about persuading them, Dakota replied. It was about showing we won't be intimidated. Elizabeth glanced back at the town hall, at the bell rope still swinging slightly from Clayton's angry pull. What happens now? She asked. Nakohe answered, his weathered face solemn. Now the real fight begins. The smell of smoke woke her. Elizabeth bolted upright in bed, the acrid scent unmistakable. Through her bedroom window, an orange glow flickered against the night sky. The store was burning. She flung herself down the back stairs in her nightdress, grabbing a shawl as she ran. The storage room door was hot to the touch. When she opened it, smoke billowed out, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. Fire, she screamed, rushing back outside to ring the emergency bell. Fire at the Mercer store. Lanterns lit in neighboring houses. Elizabeth grabbed buckets, pumping water frantically from the yard well. The flames had started in the storeroom but were spreading rapidly toward the main shop. Sheriff Prescott arrived first, doing nothing but watching as Elizabeth struggled with her buckets. "Shame about your store, Miss Mercer," he drawled, making no move to help. Others came running. The millers, several miners, shopkeepers who lived nearby. They formed a bucket brigade from the town pump, passing water to douse the flames. "The ledgers," Elizabeth gasped between coughs. "My father's records, too dangerous," James Miller restrained her from entering. The roof could collapse, but Elizabeth broke free, tying her damp shawl around her face before plunging into the smoke-filled store. She knew every inch by touch, navigating through the murky darkness to the counter where the business ledgers were kept. The most recent volume was already smoldering. She clutched it to her chest, along with the tin cash box, before staggering back toward the door. A burning beam crashed down behind her, missing her by inches. Outside, hands pulled her into the fresh air as she collapsed, the charred ledger still clutched to her chest. "Foolish woman," Sarah scolded, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "You could have been killed." Dawn broke as the last embers were extinguished. Elizabeth sat on an overturned barrel, clutching the damaged ledger, surveying the destruction. The storeroom was gone. The main shop floor had significant damage. Merchandise lay ruined by fire, smoke, and water. "It's not coincidence," James Miller said quietly, joining her. "Not after yesterday's meeting." Elizabeth nodded numbly. "Where's Dakota? And the agents?" "At the Grady property. I sent word." James hesitated. "Elizabeth, there's something else." Peterson saw riders leaving the scene. 2 men headed toward the Hargrove ranch. "Of course." Elizabeth's voice was hollow. "Clayton doesn't even bother hiding his involvement anymore." The clatter of hooves announced Dakota's arrival. He dismounted before his horse fully stopped, his face taut with concern as he strode toward her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes scanning her for injuries. "No." Elizabeth's composure finally cracked. "But the store can be rebuilt." Dakota knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You cannot." Sheriff Prescott approached, notebook in hand. "Need to ask some questions, Miss Mercer. Might be this fire was set deliberately." "By whom, Sheriff?" Elizabeth asked bitterly. "The same people who broke my windows, or perhaps those who threatened me at yesterday's meeting." "Careful with accusations," Prescott warned. "Fire might have been an accident. Oil lamp tipped over. Or maybe," his gaze slid to Dakota, "someone wanting to frame respectable citizens." Dakota rose slowly, his stance shifting subtly into one Elizabeth recognized from their first meeting. Controlled power, ready to be unleashed. "Sheriff," Agent Blackwood interrupted, arriving with Running Bear. "The territorial governor will be very interested in this incident, especially given the timing." "Just doing my job," Prescott muttered. "Then do it properly," Blackwood replied coldly. "Investigate Clayton Hargrove and his associates." Witnesses saw riders heading to his ranch. "Hearsay," Prescott dismissed. "No evidence." "There will be," Dakota promised quietly. As the morning progressed, Townspeople came to view the damage. Some offered sympathy, others barely concealed their satisfaction. Elizabeth sat amidst the ruins, the charred ledger in her lap, its pages curling and fragile from heat and water. The deed, she suddenly remembered, father's original land grant, is safe, Dakota assured her. You showed me its hiding place beneath the floorboards. I checked that section didn't burn. Elizabeth exhaled with relief. They wanted the records, proof of my water rights, proof of my payments to the bank, which you salvaged. Dakota nodded toward the damaged ledger. Brave, if reckless. Necker joined them, his weathered face grave. This attack was meant to break your spirit, not just your building. It failed, Elizabeth said, rising to her feet. The silver comb still held her hair, somehow maintaining its place through the night's chaos. My father rebuilt after a flash flood took half the store in '52. I'll rebuild now, not alone, Dakota said. Elizabeth surveyed the damage again, seeing not just destruction, but possibility. The partition wall between storeroom and shop was gone, opening the space as she'd always imagined. The back wall would be extended toward Dakota's property. What Clayton intended as an ending could become a beginning. No, she agreed, meeting Dakota's gaze. Not alone. She opened the charred ledger, its pages smoke-stained but mostly legible. 20 years of business carefully recorded in her father's hand. Then her own. Proof of her rightful ownership. Evidence against those who sought to destroy her. They'll try again, Agent Running Bear warned. Let them, Elizabeth said, her voice finding new strength. This store has stood for 28 years. It won't fall now. Dakota's hand found hers, a silent promise of support. Around them the small group of allies, the Millers, the federal agents, Nakaho, formed a protective circle. Beyond them stood Copper Creek, a town divided by prejudice and greed, but perhaps not beyond redemption. Elizabeth closed the ledger, its charred cover crumbling slightly beneath her fingers. Time to build something new. The territorial governor's seal gleamed on the heavy parchment. Elizabeth read the letter for the third time, her fingers tracing the elaborate signature at the bottom. It's real, Agent Blackwood confirmed, watching her expression. Governor Davis has officially endorsed the Trading Post initiative and ordered an investigation into Clayton Hargrove's business practices and the water rights. Elizabeth asked. Protected, Dakota replied, indicating the relevant paragraph. The governor acknowledges your original deed and has instructed the land office to register our combined properties as a federal commerce zone. A week had passed since the fire. The store's main room had been cleared of debris, the damaged walls removed to create an open space that now extended into what had been Dakota's property. Temporary canvas-covered areas still awaiting repair, but already the outline of their vision was taking shape. This changes everything, Elizabeth said, carefully folding the letter. It changes the legal landscape, Agent Running Bear cautioned. Not necessarily Clayton's determination. As if summoned by his name, the store's temporary door swung open. Clayton stood there, accompanied by Wilford and Sheriff Prescott. All three men stopped short at the sight of the federal agents. Quite the gathering, Clayton observed, his smile not reaching his eyes. Planning another attack on Copper Creek's progress. Securing it, actually, Blackwood replied, handing Clayton a copy of the governor's letter. Official notification. This property is now under federal protection as an authorized trading post, serving both territorial and tribal interests. Clayton scanned the document, his face darkening. Governor Davis overreaches his authority. He exercises it precisely, Agent Running Bear countered. Water rights violations and suspected arson fall squarely within his jurisdiction. Arson? Clayton laughed. Accidents happen, especially when businesses are poorly managed. Interesting that you immediately assumed I meant you, Mr. Hargrove, Blackwood said mildly. My statement mentioned no suspects. Clayton handed the letter to Wilford, whose banker's eyes narrowed at the financial implications. This changes nothing, Clayton declared. The railroad will still require access through these properties. Access we're willing to negotiate, Elizabeth replied, under fair terms that protect all parties' interests. You mistake your position, Miss Mercer. Clayton's voice hardened. One letter doesn't end this matter. No, Dakota agreed, stepping forward. But it does change who dictates the terms. Sheriff Prescott cleared his throat. Got a telegram from Santa Fe this morning. Marshal Cooper's riding in. Seems there's been complaints about local law enforcement. The territorial capital works efficiently when properly motivated, Agent Blackwood observed. After the men departed, Elizabeth sank onto a crate that served as temporary seating. They're not giving up. No, Dakota agreed. But neither are we. Outside, hammers rang as workers. A mix of townsfolk who supported Elizabeth and Apache men from Dakota's tribe continued rebuilding. The trading post was taking physical form, becoming more than just an idea on paper. The bell on the temporary door jangled as Sarah Miller entered, followed by several women from town. We brought food for the workers, Sarah announced, setting down baskets. And news. The widow Jenkins has pulled her savings from Wilford's bank. So have the Thompsons and Burkes. Wilford will be furious, Elizabeth said. He's already threatened to call in loans, Sarah confirmed. But people are standing firm. Your trading post represents hope. Fair prices, honest dealings, and protection from Clayton's water monopoly, added Miss Thompson, typically reserved but now resolute. My husband says Clayton charged the North Farms triple for irrigation access last season. As the women organized the meal for workers, Elizabeth watched the unlikely scene: white townswomen serving food to Apache laborers, conversations happening across cultural divides that had seemed unbridgeable weeks ago. It's working, she murmured to Dakota. Not just the building, but the bridge between communities. One meal at a time, he replied, echoing their beginning. Like a girl sharing her lunch. The territorial governor's letter lay on the makeshift counter, its official language transforming their personal stand into something larger. News of the federal backing had spread quickly, shifting the town's perception. Those who had stayed silent out of fear now found courage to choose sides. That evening, as sunlight faded, Elizabeth and Dakota stood on the partially constructed porch of the trading post. Workers had departed, leaving behind the skeleton of their vision, walls rising from ashes, windows larger than before, a space designed for cultural exchange rather than mere commerce. Marshal Cooper arrives tomorrow, Dakota said. His investigation will further constrain Clayton and Wilford. They'll be desperate, Elizabeth warned. Most dangerous when cornered. We'll be vigilant. Dakota gazed toward the hills where Nakahi and several warriors maintained a discreet watch over the property. My people understand the importance of what we're building here. And mine are beginning to, Elizabeth replied, noting the increased support from townspeople who had finally recognized Clayton's exploitation. Dakota took her hand, his thumb tracing her palm as had become his habit. When I returned to Copper Creek, I expected to repay a debt and leave. I never anticipated this. This property? Elizabeth asked, though she knew he meant more. This partnership, Dakota clarified, his eyes holding hers. This possibility. The silver comb caught the last light in Elizabeth's hair as she turned to face him fully. Possibility? She repeated softly. A good word for what we're building. Behind them stood the emerging trading post. Before them spread Copper Creek, a town in transformation, and between them grew something neither had dared name. Fragile, yet resilient, like hope, taking root in difficult soil. Marshal Cooper cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver star badge that caught the morning light as he dismounted outside the trading post. His weathered face revealed nothing as he surveyed the construction. Miss Mercer, he nodded to Elizabeth. Mr. Dakota. Quite an operation you've got here. Nearly complete, Elizabeth replied. We hope to open officially next week. Ambitious timeline. The marshal studied the Apache and white workers laboring side by side. Unusual partnership. The future often is. Dakota said, Marshal Cooper had arrived 3 days earlier, establishing temporary quarters in the telegraph office, rather than the sheriff's domain. His investigation into Sheriff Prescott had been thorough and discreet. Now he'd requested this meeting at the trading post. "Walk with me," he instructed, moving away from curious ears. Elizabeth and Dakota followed him to the edge of the property where the natural spring bubbled up from underground. "I've reviewed the evidence," Cooper stated without preamble. "Sheriff Prescott has been relieved of duty pending formal charges of corruption and dereliction." Elizabeth exhaled. "And Clayton Hargrove, more complicated." Cooper removed his hat, wiping his brow in the morning heat. "Hargrove's influence reaches beyond Copper Creek. He's friendly with territorial legislators, judges, so he escapes consequences," Elizabeth said bitterly. "I didn't say that." Cooper's eyes narrowed. "The governor's serious about water rights violations. Those affect both settlers and tribes. Politically sensitive, with Washington scrutinizing territorial management." "What happens now?" Dakota asked. "I've frozen Hargrove's ability to transfer property or water rights pending investigation. Same for Wilford's bank." Cooper repaired his hat. "They're contained for the moment." "They won't accept that quietly," Elizabeth warned. "No," Cooper agreed, "which is why I'm assigning deputies to patrol until the trading post opening. After that, the federal commerce designation provides ongoing protection." After the marshal departed, Elizabeth and Dakota continued their daily inspection of construction progress. The main building was now recognizable as their vision, spacious, well-lit, with areas designated for various goods and services. "We did it," Elizabeth marveled, running her hand along a freshly installed counter. "Despite everything, we're doing it," Dakota corrected gently. "The true test comes when we open." The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity, inventory arriving on federal wagons, furnishings being installed, signage painted. Elizabeth was reviewing supply lists when James Miller burst through the door, breathless from running. "Riders coming," he gasped. "At least 15 men. Clayton's leading them." Elizabeth and Dakota exchanged glances. "Get Marshal Cooper," Dakota instructed calmly. "Then alert Nakohe in the hills." As James ran toward town, Elizabeth moved to the window. Dust rose in the distance as horsemen approached. Dakota joined her, his face impassive though tension radiated from his body. "We knew this might happen," he said quietly. "Not so soon," Elizabeth replied. "Not with federal protection in place. Desperate men take desperate actions." The workers, sensing trouble, gathered their tools, implements that could serve as weapons if needed. The Apache among them moved with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves strategically around the building. "Get inside," Dakota urged Elizabeth. "If there's gunfire, I'm staying," she interrupted. "This is my fight too." The riders thundered to a halt before the trading post. Clayton Hargrove sat astride a black stallion, flanked by former Sheriff Prescott and men Elizabeth recognized as ranch hands and miners. Men with little to lose and cash in their pockets from Clayton's coffers. "Quite the welcome committee," Clayton called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Put down your tools, boys. We're just here to talk." "Armed men don't come for conversation," Dakota replied, stepping forward. His hand rested near the knife at his belt, but he made no threatening move. "You've disrupted the natural order." "Order things," Clayton declared. "This town has a way of doing business, a proper chain of authority." "A chain you manipulated for personal gain," Elizabeth countered, joining Dakota. "Exploiting farmers with unfair water prices, threatening those who wouldn't sell. Progress requires sacrifice." Clayton shrugged. "The railroad will bring prosperity to you," Elizabeth finished, "while others pay the price." Clayton's expression hardened. "The governor's letter is a temporary obstacle. I have friends in Santa Fe who understand the importance of development, and we have friends who understand justice," Dakota replied. As if on cue, hoofbeats sounded from the direction of town. Marshal Cooper approached with 4 deputies, their badges glinting in the sun. Simultaneously from the hillside, Nakaho appeared with several Apache warriors. their presence a silent warning. Clayton assessed the changing odds, his jaw tight with frustration. This changes nothing, Miss Mercer. The railroad will come through. Your little trading post is just postponing the inevitable. Perhaps, Elizabeth acknowledged, but it will come on fair terms that benefit all, not just a privileged few. You sound just like your father, Clayton sneered, full of principles until they bankrupt you. My father understood value beyond money, Elizabeth replied, a concept you've never grasped. Marshal Cooper positioned his horse between the groups. Mr. Hargrove, gathering armed men, could be construed as intent to intimidate federal witnesses. I suggest you disperse immediately. A tense silence followed. Elizabeth could almost see the calculations behind Clayton's eyes, weighing risk against reward, consequences against desire. We'll go, he finally said. For now, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth and Dakota. But Copper Creek has a long memory for those who stand against its interests, and history has a longer memory for those who stand for justice, Dakota replied. As the riders departed, Elizabeth released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Marshal Cooper dismounted, his star badge catching the light as he approached. Opening day just got more complicated, he observed dryly. Elizabeth looked at the trading post behind them, nearly complete, a physical manifestation of their shared vision. We'll be ready, she promised. Dakota's hand found hers, a gesture now familiar and essential. Yes, he agreed, we will. Dawn broke over Copper Creek, painting the new sign in golden light. Mercer and Dakota Trading Post, it proclaimed in bold lettering, with smaller Apache symbols carved alongside English words. Elizabeth ran her fingers over the smooth wood, tracing the intertwined designs that represented both her heritage and Dakota's. Beautiful craftsmanship, she murmured to Nico, who had carved it. The old Apache nodded, pride evident in his weathered face. Two paths becoming one, he said, indicating how the border pattern wove together traditional Apache symbols with Western motifs. Like you and Dakota, today was opening day. After weeks of construction, planning and opposition, the trading post would officially welcome customers. Tables outside displayed goods from both cultures. Handcrafted Apache baskets beside bolts of factory cloth, beadwork alongside canned goods, medicinal herbs next to patent remedies. Inside, the space was transformed from Elizabeth's modest store into something more expansive and welcoming. Large windows admitted plentiful light. The counter where Elizabeth had stood alone for years was now twice as long, with space for multiple clerks. At the back, a door connected to what had been Dakota's property, now converted into additional trading areas and meeting rooms. Nervous, Dakota asked, joining her before the sign. In the 2 months since his return to Copper Creek, he had changed to more settled, less guarded. The silver badge of his official position was polished for the occasion, though Elizabeth suspected he wore it today as much for protection as for ceremony. A little, she admitted. I keep expecting Clayton to make one last attempt to stop us. Marshal Cooper's men are patrolling, Dakota reminded her. And Clayton's legal troubles have only increased. Indeed, the investigation into water rights violations had expanded to include tax discrepancies and illegal land acquisitions. Clayton had been forced to travel to Santa Fe to answer charges, while Wilford's bank was under territorial audit. It's not just Clayton, Elizabeth said. It's the town. Will they come? Will they accept what we've built? Before Dakota could answer, the sound of approaching wagons drew their attention, not one or two, but a procession coming from town. Leading them was Sarah Miller, seated beside her husband on their buckboard. Looks like we have our answer, Dakota said softly. The Millers pulled up first, followed by a dozen other families, farmers, shopkeepers, even Pastor Whitfield's wife, though the pastor himself was noticeably absent. Wouldn't miss this for the world, Sarah declared, descending from the wagon. The children are especially excited to see the Apache crafts. As if to prove her point, several young ones ran toward the display tables, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. More surprising was the arrival of 3 Apache families from Dakota's tribe, women and children, accompanying the men who had helped with construction. Their presence, peaceful, domestic, ordinary, seemed to both startle and intrigue the white townspeople. "This is what we envisioned," Elizabeth said to Dakota as they watched the two communities cautiously beginning to interact. "Not just commerce, but connection." "The first step of many," Dakota agreed. The morning progressed with increasing activity. Townspeople who had initially kept their distance gradually approached, drawn by curiosity and the reports of those who had already ventured inside. Trading occurred in both directions, settlers purchasing Apache crafts, tribal members selecting goods from distant factories. Elizabeth found herself at the center of it all, introducing people, explaining items, facilitating exchanges that went beyond mere commerce. Across the room, Dakota did the same with quiet authority, his presence commanding respect from both communities. By midday, the trading post hummed with activity. Elizabeth was explaining the medicinal properties of an Apache herbal remedy to Mrs. Thompson when she noticed a new arrival, Charles Wilford, standing uncertainly in the doorway. The banker looked diminished somehow, his usual pompous bearing replaced by hesitation. His eyes surveyed the busy scene, lingering on the successful transactions taking place. Elizabeth approached him. "Welcome, Mr. Wilford. How may we help you today?" Wilford cleared his throat. "Observation only, Miss Mercer. Professional curiosity. Of course. Feel free to look around." As Wilford moved deeper into the store, Elizabeth rejoined Dakota near the back counter. "Wilford's here," she murmured. "I saw," Dakota replied. "Without Clayton to direct him, he seeks his own path. You think he's reconsidering his position?" "Men like Wilford follow profit," Dakota observed. "If our success continues, his allegiance may shift." Speaking of success, Elizabeth smiled, watching the busy scene before them. "I'd say we've exceeded expectations for opening day. The true measure will come in the weeks ahead," Dakota cautioned. "When novelty fades and habits reassert themselves." "Always the pragmatist," Elizabeth teased gently. "Balance to your optimism," he returned with a slight smile. As afternoon shadows lengthened, customers gradually departed with their purchases and promises to return. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, watching as the last wagons rolled away, some toward town, others toward the Apache encampment in the hills. Dakota joined her, his shoulder brushing hers as they contemplated the new sign above them. Their names joined permanently, in wood and purpose. "What happens now?" Elizabeth asked quietly. "Now," Dakota replied, his hand finding hers, "we build on this beginning." The sign caught the last light of day, the carved symbols seeming to shift and dance with the changing shadows, separate traditions flowing together into something new and enduring. Autumn painted the hills surrounding Copper Creek in gold and crimson. 6 months had passed since the trading post opened, changing not just Elizabeth and Dakota's lives, but the community itself. The morning air carried the first hint of winter's approach as Elizabeth wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulder. Dakota stood beside her in the small fenced area behind the trading post, a slender apple sapling in his hands. The hole he dug awaited its new occupant, a simple act of faith in the future. "My father planted trees everywhere we lived," Elizabeth said, watching as Dakota carefully positioned the sapling. "Even when we thought we might move on, someone will enjoy the fruit," he'd say, "even if it isn't us." "A good teaching," Dakota replied. "My people believe what we plant in the earth connects us to those who come after." Together they filled the hole, their hands working in tandem to press soil around the tender roots. The young tree stood barely taller than Elizabeth's waist, its few leaves rustling in the breeze. "It will need years to bear fruit," Dakota observed. "Then we'll need to stay years to see it," Elizabeth replied, meeting his eyes. The unspoken question hung between them, the future, their future still unresolved despite all they had accomplished. Takoda's official assignment had been extended as the trading post proved successful, but eventually the agency would reassign him, unless there was reason to stay permanently. A comfortable silence settled as they finished their work, Elizabeth fetching water while Takoda secured the sapling to a stake for support against winter winds. From inside the trading post came the sounds of business, Nakohi's voice instructing young Apache apprentices, Sarah Miller discussing inventory with the new clerk. Agent Blackwood brought news from Santa Fe, Takoda said as they stepped back to admire the planted tree. Clayton Hargrove has been formally charged with water rights violations and fraud. His properties are being held in trust, pending resolution. And Wilford, the bank will survive under new management. Wilford himself has accepted a position in Tucson, far from his former influence. Elizabeth nodded, absorbing the news. Their opponents were neutralized, the immediate threats removed. The trading post flourished, with steady business from both communities. Even Pastor Whitfield had grudgingly acknowledged its economic benefit to the town. The railroad negotiations have reopened, Takoda continued. The new commissioner is amenable to routing the line through the South Valley, preserving our water rights while still bringing progress to Copper Creek. Everything we fought for, Elizabeth mused, accomplished. Not everything, Takoda said quietly. Elizabeth turned to him, understanding his meaning. The personal question between them remained unanswered. The depth of feeling neither had fully voiced, despite growing stronger each day. "Walk with me?" Takoda asked, offering his hand. They followed the path that wound from the trading post to the spring, the water source that had started everything. Copper Creek had changed in the months since the confrontation. New businesses had opened, including a school that welcomed both white and Apache children. The town's prosperity no longer depended on Clayton's manipulations, but on genuine commerce and cooperation. At the spring, they sat on the stone bench Takoda had placed there. Water bubbled up from underground, constant and clear, flowing outward to nourish the land, much like the influence of the trading post itself. "The agency has offered me a permanent position here," Takoda said, overseeing relations between the settlement and tribal lands. "That's wonderful," Elizabeth replied, her heart quickening. "You've earned their trust. I've also asked permission for something else." Takoda turned to face her fully. From his pocket, he withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. Something unprecedented. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing the obsidian arrowhead he had carried since childhood, his last connection to his birth family. Beside it lay the silver comb Elizabeth had given him, the two artifacts nestled together like old friends. "In my culture," Takoda said softly, "a man offers his most precious possession when asking to join his life with another's." Elizabeth's breath caught, "And in mine, a woman's family must approve her choice." "I have spoken with your father," Takoda said, surprising her. "In the traditional way, my father? But he's at his grave," Takoda clarified. "I told him of my intentions, of my promise to honor his daughter and continue the legacy of fairness he began." Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "What of your people, the tribe?" "Nako speaks for my family. He has given his blessing." Takoda's hand closed around the arrowhead and comb. "But the choice is yours, Elizabeth Mercer. Our paths crossed by chance. When you shared your food with a starving boy, they joined again when I returned as a man. Whether they continue together is for you to decide." Elizabeth looked back toward the trading post, with its sign bearing both their names. Beyond it stood the newly planted apple tree, a symbol of faith in what was yet to grow. 20 years ago," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "a girl saw not an enemy, but another human being in need. Today, a woman sees not a business partner, but the other half of her heart." She placed her hand over his, feeling the shapes of arrowhead and comb beneath their joined fingers. "Our paths don't just continue together, Takoda, they become a single road." As the autumn sun warmed their shoulders, Elizabeth and Takoda sealed their promise beside the spring that had brought them together. Water and kindness, the elements from which unexpected love had grown. Behind them, the young apple tree stood waiting for seasons yet to come, its roots reaching deep into shared soil, its branches stretching toward a common sky.